Well, thank you for watching our podcast again this week. I think the main issue that took the attention of the Senate this week was, of course, the whole issue about middle-class tax cuts. And let me give you a little primer on that as I understand the issue and as I've tried to follow it over the last several years. I think most people realize we had a higher tax rate in place for most Americans during the 1990s when President Clinton was in office, a higher rate than is in place today. The rates were brought down early in President Bush's term as president, and they were brought down for middle-class families, but also for the very wealthy. And they were brought down only for a temporary period. The reason we put a limit on the length of time for those tax reductions was that to not put a limit on it would have exploded the size of the deficit. And so we recognize that. We recognize that that was not something that made good sense for the long-term economic future of the country, and therefore we said they would expire at the end of 2010. When the recession came, President Obama agreed to go ahead and keep those lower tax rates in place for another 2 years. And that was done, and now they're scheduled to expire once more at the end of 2012, and expire in the sense that they would go back to the rates that had been in place in the 1990s when President Clinton was in office. Now the question, of course, that's dividing Washington today is, do we keep those lower rates in place for all income or just for the first $250,000 worth of income? So the proposal that the Democrats made, that President Obama's been advocating for, was that we should keep those lower tax rates in place for the first $250,000 earned by a couple, all couples in the country. And I think it's $200,000 for an individual and $250,000 for a couple. But that lower tax rates above that $250,000 would not be kept in place, and those would go back to where they were in the Clinton years. And the result of that would be it would earn for the Treasury an additional $1 trillion over the next 10 years. That is about $100 billion a year of additional revenue to help reduce the size of the deficit. We had the vote yesterday, first day vote on the issue of whether to keep all of the tax cuts that were put in place during the Bush administration in place for the future, and that failed. That was the Republican proposal. And then the Democratic proposal was voted on, and that was to keep in place the tax cuts, the reduced tax rates for the first $250,000 of income for all Americans per couple. That provision passed. That passed 51 to 48. I think it's very doubtful that the House of Representatives will take this up and debate it and pass it. But it's, in my view, good policy. It begins to deal with the long-term deficit. It still keeps in place the tax provisions, the tax rates that apply to 98% of Americans. And I think that's a good thing to do in this recession, or as we're continuing to eke our way out of this recession that we've been in for several years now. But at any rate, that's the big issue. It's not just one we voted on this week. I'm sure it'll be repeated as an issue in the fall and as we approach the election. And I'm sure much of the election, presidential election and election for Congress will divide along this issue of whether or not people think we should keep in place the middle class tax cuts, or whether we should keep in place all of the tax cuts that were adopted when President Bush was in office. So that's a summary of where we are. As I say, I think it's an issue you'll continue to hear more about over the coming weeks and months. I think it's unlikely that Congress will be able to resolve this prior to the election. It will be awaiting both Democrats and Republicans once the election's behind us, and then I hope we can get agreement. Again, thanks for watching. Appreciate it.